Thank you for joining Wars of the Roses. As we continue with Part 2, our mystical initiations of a long civilization's trail, an account of recent experiences in mystic places and strange lands by Ralph M. Lewis, KRC. An article taken from Rosicrucian Digest, Volume 15, Number 2, March 1937. A Long Civilization's Trail by Ralph M. Lewis, KRC. Editor's note: this is the second episode of a narrative by the Supreme Secretary relating the experiences he and his party had in visiting mystic shrines and places in Europe and the ancient world. Our mystical initiations. With sighs of relief, we sank back against the cushions of our seats, attempting to make ourselves as comfortable in the overcrowded compartment as possible. After a delay which nearly caused us to miss the special Brussels Express, we had finally located our missing baggage on the dock, and with little opportunity for proper arrangement, were obliged to pile it about our feet and in the racks over our heads, just as the train, after a series of convulsive jerks, pulled slowly out of the domed sheds. A sudden startling clatter of the door, and there stood on the threshold the attendant, or as we term him in America, the conductor. His expression was quite apparently one of displeasure. He glanced at the baggage and at us, and said nothing. His silence and looks combined were more abusive, I am sure, than any remarks he might have made at the moment. He was, we were certain, not approving of this excess baggage in a passenger compartment. We were not left in doubt, long as to his annoyance. In a loud voice, mingling French with English and gesticulating freely, he informed us of our wrongdoing, but permitted us to keep our delicate equipment in the compartment. We were well pleased that we did not have to subject it to the rough handling of the baggage attendants. The weather was delightfully warm. The late summer sun seemed to have given the fleeting fields and pastures a mellow appearance, as though we were looking at them through an amber glass. The countryside was level and but a few feet above the sea. Artistic, rustic, thatched roof barns and houses flashed by. Patient and plodding oxen pulled crude two-wheeled carts laden with hay. Picturesquely dressed peasants with wide, baggy trousers walked slowly alongside, with one hand resting on the rack of the cart, and the other holding a wooden-pronged fork which seemed to lie heavily on their shoulders. Frater Shibley remarked that it was an animated painting, like a masterpiece from some famous gallery suddenly become a reality. A series of sharp, high-pitched blasts of the engine whistle informed us we were approaching a station, and a few seconds later we heard and felt the grinding of brakes as we pulled up to a small red brick depot with a stone flagging platform. Small-town train watchers and station hangers-on do not differ much throughout the world. They are brothers under the skin regardless of their difference in costume and nationality. A number of them, seated on cases and crates, were leaning languorously against the wall, wearing wide-brimmed hats pulled low in front to shade their eyes. They formed a soporific picture. Rosy-faced children with well-patched clothes went through a pantomime act attempting to interest passengers in their wares. The passengers, behind closed windows, did not respond. We heard it coming, the distant faint tweet of the whistle of the guard of the last car, followed by louder and shriller tweets of the whistles of the guards of the successive cars, until finally the engineer, who must have been counting each whistle corresponding to the cars of the train, acknowledged them with a shrieking blast from the engine. We were off again. To get a train underway was indeed a ceremony. Frater Brouwer remarked that the delay in starting a train in Belgium must certainly be a boon to late commuters. It was dark when we finally roared to a stop in the great metropolis of Brussels, a city having a population of more than 700,000. We were pleased to learn that our hotel was a few steps from the railroad station. In fact, located on the same great cobblestone square which the station itself faced. Several times before, large parties of Rosicrucians from America and various sections of Europe had gathered at this hotel while attending important conclaves in Brussels. The Rosicrucians were well known to the management as an orderly, congenial group of guests, and his hospitality was accordingly responsive. Our party had adjoining suites, ones that had been occupied by the Imperator's party but 2 years previously. I was late for an important engagement, how important I did not fully realize. I called Mademoiselle Guesdon on the telephone. She was residing at the same hotel, having come from Paris for the same conclave and to kindly act as my official interpreter. She excitedly asked that Mrs. Lewis and myself meet her in the main lobby at once. To meet Mademoiselle Guesdon, Grand Secretary of the AMORC in France, is to know an exceedingly intelligent and highly efficient woman with much administrative experience. With all of her firmness and ability to accomplish what seems the impossible at times, she is refined, kindly, and most considerate. Years of intimate association with the commercial world in an executive capacity have not lessened her mystic insight and her philosophic trend of mind. She's performed innumerable services for the AMORC of America and its supreme officers. Speaking in perfect English and in a hushed voice, she told us that Hieronymus, the Rosicrucian Imperator of Europe, could only attend that night's secret conclave of the Fudosi, the great federation of the arcane mystic orders of the world. He must leave early the next day for another city in Belgium. In fact, he had been in conference for a day before we arrived and had waited and was now waiting for us. We felt grieved that we had been a cause of delay, but Mademoiselle Guesdon hastened to assure us that our schedule had been proper, but that sudden unexpected affairs made it necessary for Hieronymus to depart sooner than he had anticipated. Since we must leave at once, there was no time for preparation. Mrs. Lewis and I hastily informed the other members of our party where we were going, and then hurriedly joined Mademoiselle Guesdon at the street curb. We frantically signaled a taxi, and in my excitement I called to the driver in English, which amused the early evening sidewalk cafe patrons. To them we were running true to form, like all Americans, in a constant rush. We feel that the speed with which we travel through life is the cause of our accomplishments, and that these accomplishments are the worthy ends of life. Our Belgian friends shrug their shoulders and admit that Americans accomplish stupendous things, but are these things the true end of life, is their query. Do they bring the American any greater happiness and contentment than the quiet enjoyment of every hour of living which the Belgian ordinarily experiences? Speaking rapidly in French to our rotund chauffeur, who looked none too comfortable, crammed into the very limited space between the wheel and the hard, upright seat back, Mademoiselle Guesdon gave directions for reaching our destination. Concerning exactly where we were going and what was to occur, I was still very much in the dark. I ventured to quiz Mademoiselle Guesdon, and finding her non-committal on this point, dropped the matter. This attitude only quickened my imagination and further stimulated my enthusiasm. No further words were spoken. We, Mrs. Lewis and myself, sat in suspense, each keeping to his or her own thoughts. We drove across great plazas walled in by massive stone buildings having medieval-looking turrets and high iron gates. Walking rhythmically before them were uniformed sentinels carrying regulation rifles with bayonets fixed. I could only conjecture that they were guarding public buildings. The dignified solemnity of these settings was broken by the clanging bells of high, narrow but short-length electric trams which rocked from side to side as they clattered along. Suddenly, Mademoiselle Guesdon tapped loudly on the glass partition separating us from the driver. Bringing his cab to a stop, he inquired in French as to her desires. After much hand-waving on the chauffeur's part, he was finally convinced by Mademoiselle Guesdon that he was not taking us in the right direction, and he turned to travel in a direction from which it seemed to me we had just come. I did not know what to look for, but I was surprised when our cab stopped in a semi-residential shopping district. I hesitated before leaving the cab. "Do we get out here?" I inquired. "Yes," Mademoiselle Guesdon replied, smiling at my bewilderment. We walked rapidly about a block, passing many attractive little shops. Mademoiselle Guesdon stopped in front of one and looked in the doorway. I walked closer and looked into the large plate glass window front. There were platters of cakes and large green bowls of delicious-looking salads. I looked at the large block letters painted on the glass above me. The establishment was a restaurant catering to those who preferred vegetarian and fruit dishes. But why are we stopping here, I wondered. I turned and looked in the direction of Mademoiselle Guesdon. She beckoned to us to enter. This is strange, I thought. She had been anxious to reach our destination, was in a hurry in fact, and now we were dining before proceeding. She apparently realized my confusion and enlightened me. "We are here," she said. "The conclave," I began, and she motioned for me not to speak, for a genial hostess with a voluminous colored apron was approaching us. The hostess was about to accept us as patrons. usher us to a table in the large room in which there were several tables already occupied by diners. But Mademoiselle Guesdon stepped up to her quickly, and in a manner that attracted no attention, spoke to her in a whisper which I could not overhear. The woman turned, looked at us intently for a moment, and then nodded her head in the direction of a small door at the opposite end of the room. We followed her in single file toward it. Upon reaching the door, she bowed, turned, and left us. Mademoiselle Guesdon, turning to us, said, "Wait here, please. I shall return shortly." The patrons, eating in the leisurely manner which is the custom of the country, paid us no attention, for which we were grateful, for our faces must have revealed our pent-up emotions. It seemed an age, but in reality, the passing of time must have been but 3 minutes before Mademoiselle Guesdon returned. "You shall follow me," she said solemnly. We did. We entered a short, dark hallway. As I recall, it had a turn in it because I could not see the other end until suddenly I was standing in an oblong chamber. The room was about 35 feet in length and about 18 feet wide. It had, if memory serves me well, a plank floor and a low-hanging plastered ceiling. It was lit by candles located at the far end of the room. Shadows danced about us on the wall with each flicker of the candle flames, adding to the enigmatic atmosphere of the occasion. Our eyes were rooted to the scenes which the candles illuminated. There was a long but narrow U-shaped table with the open end toward us. The table in reality consisted of a series of small tables placed together and covered with crisp and brilliant white in contrast to the yellow candlelight tablecloths. Around the outer side sat a group of impressive-looking men. None were eating, although they obviously had been. They looked straight at us. Their faces were expressionless but not cold and steely. We felt, standing there in the part shadows, as though we were apparitions being looked upon by a solemn committee of investigators into psychic phenomena. I stepped forward and then stood hesitating. As though this had been a given signal, the gentlemen all arose as one, stood erect, motionless, waiting for what I did not know. Again, Mademoiselle Guesdon came to our aid. In a low voice she said, "Permit me to introduce you." I was fascinated by one personage. He stood behind the closed end of the U-shaped table in the exact center. His position was directly in front of me. I had tried turning my eyes from him. I did not wish to stare discourteously, and yet, as if magnetically drawn, I would become conscious that I had turned again to hold his eyes. He would have attracted attention anywhere. He was tall, stately, well-groomed, conservatively attired. He had a neatly trimmed white beard, which gave him an air of distinction without being conspicuous. His complexion, for a man of his age, and he must have been 60 years, was startlingly youthful, a healthful pink. I could not detect the color of his eyes from where I stood. They were to me two radiant, scintillating gems. Points of light would perhaps better describe them. Slowly, Mademoiselle Guesdon led us down the center aisle formed by the opening of the U directly toward him. When but 3 feet from him, she stopped. Slowly, and in a quiet tone of voice, Mademoiselle Guesdon spoke to him in French. She was introducing me, then he spoke. I do not recall his words. In fact, I did not. As I now recollect, remember hearing words at all, but it seemed as if I were hearing a voice calling from a great distance. Indistinct but melodious, soothing, somewhat like a chant. I seemed to understand inwardly what was being said, rather than objectively perceiving it. He was extending greetings. Then he smiled and put forth his hand in welcome. As he smiled, his whole face lit up with a beautiful glow. I realized then what the master painters sought to capture on canvas when they wished to have their subjects, saints, mystics, and great philosophers of old, appear to radiate the esoteric light which had dwelt within them. It is something which the chemical elements of paint and pigments can never portray. In fact, it is more sensed than seen. This man before me was the Imperator of Europe, known only by his symbolic name Hieronymus. He was one of the 3 Rosicrucian imperators of the world, of which Dr. H. Spencer Lewis of our jurisdiction is one. I was not awed by the occasion, but rather a great wave of humility swept over me. I felt a keen sense of devotion to the order which it is my privilege and honor to serve. There flashed in my mind a vivid picture of my obligations and duties, and the thought of the many who had gone before me and had made possible what we hold so sacred today. We were now led to our places at this table. Then each of the gentlemen filed by us and was introduced to us in turn. We played with our food, hungry as we were and delicious as it was. Somehow we thought that giving time to eating on such an auspicious occasion would be nothing short of profane, though it would have been in proper order. A few moments later all arose at the sound of the gavel and quietly retired from the room. I was about to leave when a young man of about 33 or 34 years of age, slender, wiry, with high forehead and the facial characteristics of one who is distinctly a student and devoted to a mental life, came forward and said in English, "Kindly wait with Mademoiselle Guesdon. You shall be admitted later." I felt a strong liking for this frater. He was personable and understanding. He was our noted Frater Malinger, prominent in the legal profession of his country and a moving spirit in the administrative affairs of the Fudosi. I had corresponded with him on numerous occasions relative to official matters of our order. In fact, I had with me at this time secret and confidential documents to deliver to him. He was exactly as I had visualized him, a human dynamo of energy and accomplishment. He left us and joined the others. Once again we were alone, Mademoiselle Guesdon, Mrs. Lewis and myself. I turned to Soror Guesdon questioningly. Before I could speak, she anticipated my thoughts. "You are about," referring to Mrs. Lewis and me, "to be inducted into the 13th traditional historical degree of our order," referring to AMORC. "Only a few members of every jurisdiction are eligible to receive its honors, secrets and wisdom." We were more than elated and grateful. A few moments later, a frater came through the portal which led to the chamber into which all the others had retired. He spoke hurriedly in French to our interpreter and guide and returned. Once again, Soror Guesdon bade us follow her, which we did. This became an unforgettable evening in our lives. We crossed the threshold and dwelt within for nearly an hour, though we were not conscious of time. What transpired there must be sealed in my heart and mind. I can only impart my experiences to those who are prepared to receive them. And like me, they will never know when they will be considered prepared until the invitation has been extended to them to receive this knowledge at a proper time and at a proper place. My next day was an exceptionally busy one. No time for sightseeing, no tours or ramblings. There was too much to be accomplished. By appointment, I met Frater Malinger at his office, to which Mademoiselle Guesdon took me. Their important documents concerning the welfare and extension of the AMORC in America were signed and sealed. Official communications from the Imperator of AMORC in America were personally delivered to Frater Malinger for the consideration of Fudosi officers. The mutual plans and problems of the Rosicrucian Order of the North and South American jurisdiction and the Order of Europe were discussed, and constructive ideas exchanged. For the first time I heard the phrase, "And it shall be the duty of America to preserve this for future generations." I thought it strange, but passed it by without question. Later, Mrs. Lewis, Soror Guesdon and I were the luncheon guests of Frater and Soror Malinger at their home. A delicious repast was enjoyed in most pleasant surroundings, Soror Malinger being an excellent hostess. Immediately following luncheon, Frater Malinger, Mademoiselle Guesdon and I attended the meeting of a special Fudosi convention committee some distance from the former's home for a further consideration of organization matters of importance. Several days had elapsed since our arrival in Brussels, but this night was to be an eventful one in this very eventful city. Mrs. Lewis, Frater Brouwer and myself were to be inducted into the Order of the M, one of the oldest arcane orders of Europe. For centuries it had been a contemporary of the Rosicrucian Order, a body of preliminary training and preparation for the higher degree studies of the Rosicrucian Order, perpetuating many noble traditions and ideals. It had numbered among its membership many learned men throughout Europe whose names are milestones in history. Frater Brouwer, who had never been abroad before and had not previously had the pleasure and privilege of meeting the dignitaries of these august orders of light, was in a high state of expectation and enthusiasm. For him, the hours of the day slowly waned as he waited for the evening when we were to go to our place of initiation. We had been advised to dress semi-formally for the occasion, and we were dressed considerably in advance and waiting with undue impatience in the foyer of our hotel for Mademoiselle Guesdon, who, as usual, was most punctual. It was dark and rainy when we left in a chugging taxi for our destination. The streets, for so large a city, were quite deserted. The evening was one that induced a melancholy mood. Reflections of the odd-shaped street lamps cast grotesque patterns of light on the slippery pavements. No one spoke. Each treasured silence. To me, it was an intriguing adventure. Some of the streets through which we passed were so narrow that the shadows of the houses on either side intensified the darkness, so that we seemed to be riding through deep canyons. The streets twisted to such an extent that neither end could be visible, which added to the realism of the impression. I could not help but think of the sagas of the neophytes of our beloved order who, in the Middle Ages, seeking light as we, crept from their homes in the dead of night, such a night as this, and pulling closely over their heads the cowls of their cloaks so as to partly conceal their faces. Flitted along in the shadows like things of another world, seeking others who would, in the deep shadows of the eaves of some home, meet them. Together they would secretly enter and surreptitiously conduct a conclave of our order, fearing any moment to hear the crash of the door and find in their midst officers of church and state who would arrest them for daring to go beyond, in their studies and thoughts, the prescribed confines of the ecclesiastical and state laws of what should constitute knowledge. Though I was to experience no such danger, I thrilled with the thought of the danger they experienced, to gain what we, of the jurisdiction of North and South America and the allied jurisdictions, enjoy so freely and sometimes unappreciatively. After a ride of about 10 minutes, we came to an abrupt stop on a slight hill. Stepping from the taxi so as to avoid pools of muddy water, we stood on the sidewalk in front of a brown stone building that resembled the mental picture one gains from the descriptions of homes in French novels, architecture of the 16th and 17th centuries. It was quaint, intriguing, the sharp-pointed roof, the garret windows, the well-worn steps leading to the main entrance, and the small doorway at the left below with its heavy wooden door and small grated windows. Presuming that this was the place we were to enter because it seemed to have an atmosphere of mystery and secrecy, I started in advance of the others to walk up the steps toward the large doors which were closed, and through small glasses in the upper portion of which was shining a faint light. Mademoiselle Guesdon called out to me to return. I said upon reaching her, "Is not this the place?" "Yes," she said, "but not the entrance." She turned and we followed her. She approached the small door at the left. In fact, to reach this door, we had to go down 2 or 3 steps. To me, it had seemed like a servant's or delivery entrance. We stood behind her, our coats drawn about us tightly. It was still raining and miserably uncomfortable. Not a soul was to be seen on the street. It was exceptionally dark because there was only a faint street lamp at either end of the long block. She knocked 3 times. I recalled the symbolic knock in one of our rituals. We waited what seemed to me a great length of time. No one spoke. She made no further effort to knock. Finally, I heard a bolt being drawn in the door, and the door must have been heavy and not used frequently, for it opened slowly as though the one who was opening it found it an effort to do so. It creaked. We looked in. There was a hallway, a short one, well illuminated by an odd electric fixture hanging on the high ceiling, casting a peculiar pattern on the floor. To the right of the entrance in front of which we stood was a stairway that led upward, only one flight of it being visible. The hallway was inviting. It radiated a spirit of friendliness, warmth, light, cheerfulness. Immediately before us stood a frater, tall, well-proportioned, and wearing a flowing white gown and a black mask which concealed all of his face, but just a slight portion of his forehead and his mouth and chin. He said but one word, "Enter." We did. We filed in and lined ourselves against the wall of the hallway. He closed the door, bolted it, spoke nothing further, turned at right angles, walked slowly up the long stairway, we following him with our eyes as he did so. Again silence reigned, and no one made the effort to speak. Speaking seemed to be out of order. No one seemed to want to shatter his impressions with words. In a few moments this frater returned, and smiling and speaking in English, asked us to please follow. Mademoiselle Guesdon led. The robed frater took up the rear. We climbed the flight of stairs to another passageway identical with the one below, except that in this hallway were 2 doors. We waited outside one. The robed frater opened it just enough to pass into the chamber, but we could not see in and knew not what to expect. He returned a few moments later and had in his hand 3 large white silk handkerchiefs. We were asked to remove our coats and hats, and then each of us was blindfolded, and each of us was led through the open doorway into the chamber of initiation. The masks were not removed until we had had such experiences as made it seem that we had lived for centuries and traveled to other worlds, and thus concluded my first initiation in the Order of the M. I was to have still others. The next night was to be our last one in Brussels. It was to be one of merriment, sociability, brotherhood. During the next day, Mrs. Lewis and Mrs. Shibley were free to visit some of the excellent shops in Brussels, noted for their fine laces and needlework. They had to return early, however, to prepare for the official Fudosi banquet, a banquet which concludes all these official sessions. At 7:00 p.m. on that evening, Mademoiselle Guesdon again acted as our guide. Our party, however, was increased in number this time. We drove along one of the main boulevards in Brussels, well illuminated with sparkling, scintillating electric signs as modern as any we find in America. Along this boulevard there prevailed the typical continental atmosphere. There were blocks dotted with little sidewalk cafes, little tables over which there were awnings, and about which people sat sipping wines, drinking coffee, and watching humanity file by. We eventually came to our destination, a well-illuminated and fashionable appearing restaurant, a large place. We entered, and the maître d'hôtel escorted our party to the second floor, where, in a large dining hall, the convention tables were spread. There were hosts of representatives of the various occult, mystical, and arcane orders of Europe and the world gathered there. Some were in full dress, wearing their emblems of office, and some wore their ritualistic capes. Among those present was the eminent Grand Master of the Order of M, into which I had just been inducted, a man of prominence in his own country, an outstanding figure in the political world. More about him will come later. I was introduced to a kindly old soul, well over 80 years of age, Grand Master of the Hermetic Brotherhood, a master of occult law. He spoke English, and I spent a very pleasant half hour discussing the work of the AMORC in North and South America with him. There were also many others there who were distinguished personages. I had the pleasure of meeting our good Frater Greuter of southern France, who holds a prominent AMORC office in that country and who is also active in the work of the Fudosi. A delightful banquet was served. There was entertainment and there were speeches in various languages. I had the pleasure of addressing this congregation, and Mademoiselle Guesdon interpreted my address to those present who could not understand English. We returned to our hotel in the early hours of the morning, feeling that we had concluded a very successful stay in Brussels and had had an experience that made life worth living. Late as was the hour, or rather I should say as early in the morning as it was, we were obliged to pack and prepare for an early morning journey to France, to Paris. Thank you for watching, and please don't forget to share, like, subscribe and comment, and if you can please consider donating to Wars of the Roses. Links to PayPal and Patreon are in the description. Thank you so very much.